Hey everyone, hope all is well. My name is Miles Dyer and welcome to the Quest for Global Empathy. I am always incredibly grateful for the conversations that come out of these episodes, whether it's on the comments of YouTube video uploads on youtube.com/miles or across social media after they go live on podcast platforms including Spotify, Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. And there has been this common question or point of conversation that has come up repeatedly these last few weeks, which is around the notion of compassion, humanism, and obviously the quest for global empathy. And it can be distilled to this. When it comes to going on a quest for global empathy, is that just about humans, or is that something that also applies to animals and the natural world as well? I think today's guest is going to be excellent for dealing with exactly that. Her name is Jennifer White. She is an activist and the UK Media and Communications Manager for PETA, which is the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And she joins us now. Jennifer, thanks for coming on the Quest for Global Empathy.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So it's your first day back in the office, I believe, today?
Yeah, first day in a long time, but thought you deserved the good backdrop, so.
Very, very, very
Better
kind.
than my living room.
How have you found it during COVID? I think you said you've been in your office a few times already, but...
Yeah, a couple of times, mainly just to sort of pick up bits here and there, get some office equipment and so on. But no, I've been really lucky actually when sort of COVID hit the PETA UK offices in London and we were all able to work from home very quickly. Actually, we adapted super quick and I was so lucky to be able to do my role pretty much as normal from home, except instead of going into the studios to do the interviews that I sometimes do as part of my job, I was able to do them all on Zoom. So that was a bit different.
It really has been a great learning process for not just us as individuals, but companies to, see what the best way is of doing things. And actually, a lot of this can be done digitally. And as someone who lives outside London, I've worked for many companies within London, and the idea of traveling 90 minutes each way each day and getting stressed before the workday even starts, it is just absurd. And so hopefully there is going to be a real revolution of the way we perceive work and where we need to be. But obviously office space is important because you need to collaborate on things. And
yeah, I think we're going to probably, I don't think we'll be back in full time for a long time, if ever, but it is definitely nice knowing that you've got that place where you can come to and you can meet colleagues and you can have those big meetings around around the meeting room tables if that's what you want to do rather than just a Skype call. But it is nice not having that pressure to be like, oh, I've got to get the Northern Line every morning or something.
Right. No, for sure. I've been really glad you've come on the show because, funnily enough, especially in the last few episodes, when they're broadcast on a Monday, seeing the conversations, and for those that are listening and watching, we do pay attention to the conversations that I had in response to the episodes. There's been a lot of questions around the quest for global empathy when we've had people on talking about humanism or compassion. There's a lot of questions around, well, for global empathy to be achieved, does that transcend human beings? Surely that should, be put out to animals and, nature as a whole, which I think absolutely. There's a lot of conversations to be had there. And so when you said you were available to come on this one, I thought, perfect, great opportunity for this because you work for PETA. How long have you worked with them for?
So I've been at PETA now for just over 6 years, which is crazy, actually. It's gone by in the blink of an eye.
Yeah. And what brought you to that company? Were you an animals activist leading up to it? Had you worked with PETA unofficially, just as an activist, or
no,
how did that journey start?
So it's a wee bit random going back now.
Always random.
I did criminology at university, so I always had in my head that I would go into the police or something similar, sort of helping humans. And then whilst I was sort of in my final few months of studying, I read a book by Jonathan Safran Foer called Eating Animals, which is basically a journey where he had a son and he basically wanted to see what he was feeding his son, or rather who he was feeding his son. And the journey of the book looks at how we treat animals in this like industrialized world that we're now living in. And one of the quotes in that book was something along the lines of how we are all responsible for what we don't do. So not responding is still a response. And that really had quite a big impact on me, because I didn't realize how much action there actually is by not acting. And I realized that I didn't want to be sort of complicit in how we're treating animals that way. So I started to go sort of vegetarian and then moved towards being vegan. And then I realized that actually, even more than not wanting to be complicit in it, I wanted to help other people sort of understand what I'd sort of learned and understood. And I knew that the best place to do that would be at PETA. So I also had this sort of terrible animal rights blog at the time, which I think has now been like deleted. It's just been taken off the web, I think.
Why terrible?
By me. I mean, I guess it was just very early days. Like I'd never had any experience of sort of being a blogger or anything. So I was just sort of giving it my best shot, you know. And
what sort of things did you write about? Like what aspect of it, or was it just anything?
So the things that I think I found especially frustrating, like I used to work at a clothing store, so I'm from Edinburgh originally, and there was a huge phase when I was working there where every staff member seemed to be going out and buying these Canada Goose jackets, and they all had the coyote fur trim. But all these people that I was working with at the time, who, you know, I really liked as people, they also claimed to love dogs. And I couldn't understand for the life of me how they couldn't understand that the dogs that they, you know, either were sharing their homes with or that they were taking on walks, they were wearing like the same sort of species around their neck. And the coyotes for those jackets, you know, they were killed in these steel drawer traps, or they were bludgeoned to death, you know, these horrific deaths. So I would sort of take to my blog and I guess sort of outline those sorts of argument points to try and get people to connect the dots. Not that I think anyone was really reading it at that stage. But then the blog actually helped me get an internship with PETA UK's digital marketing team. So I started off as their intern, and I just loved my time here so much. Like I never wanted to leave. So I was applying for jobs in all different departments, one even being in the fundraising team, which would have been a very numbers heavy job, which would have been awful for me. But I was just like, I just didn't want to go. And then just as fate would have it, on the very last day of my internship, the director of PETA UK at the time took me into one of the meeting rooms and she said, "We've made a job for you as the assistant press officer, if that's something you'd be interested in." And of course I just like burst into tears and was like, yes, I'll take it. And then I've just never left.
That's amazing. So how big is the PETA UK team?
We're pretty small, actually. I think there's probably around between 30 and 40 of us.
Okay.
But it's quite tricky, especially now we're all remote working. I'm not quite sure sort of who's joined and who hasn't in the time. But yeah, we're pretty small office.
Because I've always known PETA to be this American organisation. Like, is it quite recent? When I say recent now, I'm probably going to say like the last decade. Has PETA been in the UK longer than a decade, or?
Yeah, so PETA's been here. I think PETA UK has been for about 15, maybe even a bit over 15,
right.
Maybe 20 years. And then PETA US has been over 35 years. But we're all separate entities. So there's PETA US and then PETA UK is a separate entity. We also have PETA Asia, PETA India, PETA France, PETA Germany, PETA Netherlands, PETA Latino. So there are a whole host of PETA entities all over the world, all sort of focusing on different animal issues in those countries.
And I assume that's because different countries have different cultures and therefore there's different pressures in terms of how animals are treated.
Yeah, there's different issues affecting animals in different countries. And it's obviously very important to have people based in those areas, especially as some of the entities have sort of rescue shelters, or they do sort of more like field work. So actually going out into the areas and protecting like stray animals, animals living on the street, which of course, you know, isn't a huge issue here in the UK because we have so many rescue shelters available for those animals. But yeah, every affiliate and entity is very sort of specific to the issues in that country.
Is there much difference between the US and the UK in terms of animal issues? I don't know.
There is in a sort of regulatory way. Regulations are sort of very different for things like animal testing, and I guess also, I mean, America is just so huge, so the scale that PETA US has to work on is very different to what PETA UK would sort of have to deal with. And also in the US, I don't know if you during lockdown 1 watched Tiger King. Like
I
most
haven't.
Of the UK.
So many have asked me about that.
Yeah, well, something they have in the US are these like roadside zoos, which are like unaccredited, really shoddy facilities where animals live in, you know, tiny pens, very sort of unregulated. And it was like the zoos that you saw in Tiger King, where animals, exotic animals like tigers and lions, are essentially just being kept as pets in really awful conditions. And that's something that we thankfully don't have here in the UK. We don't have sort of roadside zoos, so...
It's nice to know we don't have tigers being kept in the UK that could break out.
Well, so unfortunately, I spoke too soon. So we do actually, you can keep lions and tigers as pets in the UK, but they can't be in sort of facilities that you could charge people to go and see. So there are a couple of people. Yeah.
Is that the only regulation? You just can't charge for people to see it, but you could just keep one?
Well... Technically, they have to sort of abide by sort of zoo, like local councils have to make sure they're abiding by zoo regulations. But yeah, there was a show a couple of months ago. Actually, it was I think it was Ross Kemp on like Britain's Tiger Kings or something, and there were some pretty awful facilities on there. So it is still an issue, but thankfully not quite as prevalent as it is in the US.
I just like the idea of the council, you know, going through their checklist of things to do, and it's like, oh, we've had a letter in regarding, you know, someone who wants to have a lion in their garden and their neighbour's not happy.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. None of the neighbours are happy because they don't want to risk the animals getting out. But also, it's incredibly depressing, I think, if you had to look over and see a tiger being kept in a pen in someone's garden. You know, it's so unnatural.
I don't know if it is actually on the Tiger King that it's mentioned, but a friend told me this statistic that there are more, I think it's tigers kept in captivity privately in the US than there are tigers in the wild around the world. Yeah, no, it's true because tigers. So for the sort of roadside zoos, they also, a lot of them do these like cub petting sort of experiences where, you know, people pay for their children or whatever to cuddle these baby tigers and lions. And the problem is that, you know, those lions all grow up and those tigers all grow up. So there's this huge like churn and turnover for these cubs, which means a lot of them either get abandoned or killed. But so many of them are bred into captivity sort of for those purposes, which is really sad. I do think a lot about growing up and my attitudes towards animals, and I do think one awakening I had, I think when it comes to developing empathy, there are always these sort of gateways of empathy that you get exposed to a documentary or a story. And I've always spoken about, like, once something is known, it can't be unknown. Like, compassion, empathy is something that's hard to turn a blind eye on once that you make that connection. And an example for me would be Blackfish, the documentary about SeaWorld. Now, I went to SeaWorld as a kid, absolutely loved it. My parents took me. We all had a great time. I thought that they were taken very well. Well, they are taken care of, but they're in captivity. And I think that this is the constant argument that people that work at SeaWorld and trainers say, which is, and it's actually on the documentary, they always counter the criticism saying, but we don't mistreat them, we give them all the food, we look after them. And it's like, actually, that is all true, but you're still not taking into consideration that that's you know, where they live is the equivalent of like a human like living in a bathtub, you know. Exactly. And I've had interesting conversations with my parents about it, because I think my parents, you know, wouldn't go to SeaWorld now. And I don't know if they've explicitly said that they felt guilty about going, but I totally understand why they took me, because back then there wasn't really the education about it. You know, you went to SeaWorld where you had these talks about, you know, this is how they live, and this is, you know, it's educational, and it seems like, yeah, they're being taken good care of. And then as you learn about it, you realise, no, this isn't right. And so whenever I see, you know, Instagram reel posts of anything in a zoo, I just feel depressed, and I feel like I'm always going to be that person in the comments that goes, they shouldn't be in cages. And so, like, the only zoos I think I've seen that I've liked are I I don't know what they're called, but it's where the humans are in the cage. They go out into the
Yeah.
outdoors, and so the humans are in the cage. And I'm like, that's exactly how it should be. I've never been to London Zoo. I can't remember the last time I went to a zoo, but I think there are a lot of societal pressures around sort of like not being the Grinch. And I can think about it like at Christmas time, I don't like sending Christmas cards. On birthdays, I'm like, don't send me any, because I think it's just a waste of paper. And especially if all you're going to write is 2 miles and then from so-and-so, just text me, it's fine. And I think, but there are these societal pressures whenever we look at things like zoos of, come on, but it's nice, isn't it, to go and see some animals? And I don't know, I think that's probably one of the bigger battles that we have in terms of developing compassion for animals in society.
Yeah, no, I think that's everything you've said is so spot on. And I think it's very difficult, especially when people are trying to think what's best for children. You know, a lot of the time, if I'm doing interviews and it is about a zoo or an aquarium or a marine park, you know, people are always like, but children want to see these animals. And, you know, I was like you, I was taken to a marine park that had orcas. I don't think it was SeaWorld. It was in Canada when I was younger. And I used to be a member of Edinburgh Zoo. But really, things that I grew up thinking, it sounds so naive now, but, you know, I used to think that in the wild, tigers would pace back and forth. Like, my child brain didn't really sort of understand that actually that's only something that they do in captivity. And that's something that we really try and explain now, is that it's not educational to take children to see animals in these unnatural conditions. You know, you don't learn what animals are actually like in the wild when you go to these facilities. And the best way for children to learn is through documentaries or from going out into the wild and, you know, seeing some animals. Obviously, it's not possible for everyone to go on a safari, but it's also not something that we should be entitled to as humans. You know, we're not entitled to see tigers, you know, a meter away from us. That's not something that should, you know, be a right, especially when it comes at the sacrifice of their sort of overall well-being and especially like their mental well-being as well. And that's something that the orcas at SeaWorld, like you said, you know, they might be getting the right food or, you know, sort of the basic level of care, but mentally these animals are struggling, you know, immensely.
And that's why sometimes they attack the trainers. It's lashing out and, you know.
Yeah, it was funny. Well, it wasn't funny, but
I know what you mean.
Blackfish Blackfish came out the year before I think I sort of started my like vegetarian vegan journey, and it also connected so many dots for me in terms of that, assuming on the surface everything is fine, but you're not actually looking sort of past it. You're not looking past the obvious. And once you actually start learning about how much they're suffering, it does just remove any enjoyment from it. And in the 6 years I've been at PETA, we've had huge victories with the SeaWorld campaign, with anything sort of regarding marine, like captive marine animals. We've had SeaWorld now no longer breed any more orcas into captivity. Marineland in France has now pledged to not take on any more orcas or breed orcas, and they're trying to get the remaining orcas into seaside sanctuaries. And we really are just seeing this whole move away. And, you know, it's not going to be long until we look back and sort of view it the same way that we do like wild animal circuses, for example. So good progress.
Yeah. I just feel that bringing people on side whenever you're talking about social causes, the people that we should be building bridges with first, I mean, we should obviously be opposing the people that are actively harming, you know, whatever the cause is, so harming animals, mistreating. But I do find the bigger battle is winning the hearts and minds of the general public overall. And so there are lots of social issues where there are people that are perpetrators of negative social actions, whether it's, you know, subtle bigotry or racism, sort of the underneath the surface. It's not like explicit, like someone might not use the N-word, but actually their behaviour or attitudes are in fact racist. Same regarding the way that we treat animals, and, you know, going to SeaWorld is actually not seen as actively being someone that would, you know, harm an animal, you know, but actually they are contributing to a facility that is arguably harming more animals in the long run. And so it makes me think a lot when it comes to activism about how you bring people on side, how you build bridges. It's about finding that middle ground. And it's not saying that you meet at the middle ground, but it's or you end at the middle ground. That's where you can then bring them to your side or show them the way. Because I think shame is used a lot, especially in social media. And I think shaming is incredibly negative or ineffective because it makes people become defensive. And so when I saw you first on Good Morning Britain with Piers Morgan, the way I describe it was I honestly felt PETA came across a lot more modern and progressive than I'd ever perceived PETA as an organisation before. And there's one moment before we get to the general conversation I have to mention, which was Piers Morgan, and this is when I first got in contact with you because I thought this is absolutely amazing. You were talking about how we shouldn't be using certain language to... so, for example, I think you like calling someone a pig because... the connotation is pigs are dirty or unintelligent, when in fact, pigs are more intelligent than dogs. And, language does shape our perceptions in the world. And therefore, by tackling some of these phrases we use casually, it can actually have a profound impact on the way that we do perceive, in this case, animals. But it could range across a lot of social issues. So you're talking about this on Good Morning Britain, this UK Good Morning show. And... I think Piers Morgan made a point, something along the lines of, I don't know if he used this example, but it was something along the lines of like, we have all this knife crime and stuff like this, and you're bleating on, you probably didn't say bleating because that would have been related to sheep, but he would have said, and you're going on about not calling people pigs. And then you made the great point, which was, the reason I'm on this show is because your producer contacted me and said, we want to talk about this today. So I'm on here to answer your questions. And now you're criticising me for the very reason you invited me on in the first place. And I've, for a very long time, been a critic of the media. Not like all-out war saying all media and journalists are scum, all this sort of stuff. But there are ways that the mainstream media conducts itself, which is not good for civil discourse. It's always about polar opposites and controversy and generating the clicks. And I really loved the way that you sort of just made that clear point. And actually, Piers Morgan agreed with you and went a bit quiet there. And I could tell he had a quiet respect for you in that moment. But the reason I bring up about this sort of modern perspective I had of PETA is when I've known of PETA in the past, I've never looked deeply into the organisation, but I think growing up watching... Have you ever seen the South Park episode about PETA?
I have, actually, yeah.
So I think they have to get a new a new mascot for the school because it was like the South Park cows, and someone from PETA threw a bucket of blood on it and said murderers. And then PETA live in this sort of a feral village where they're having relationships with animals. Just what South Park does best, satire and all that sort of stuff. But PETA has always been seen as extremist in some ways, always about controversy, always about sparking conversation, but with very stark imagery, really loud, I'd say aggressive imagery at times. And so I'm just curious to know, what do you feel is the strategy for PETA? Because you obviously, it's still done now, but is there evidence that it works? Like when I talk about the people that we need to be bringing on side who are more, would be willing to listen, but as soon as they're attacked and are associated with, violent imagery or aggressive language, I'm just curious to know your take on that.
Yeah, goodness, so many points I want to
there
address.
Are, and I apologise.
I'll try start from a logical place. With us, we want to keep animal suffering at the forefront of people's minds. And in an ideal world, we would just have a press conference where we could just tell people the facts and communicate it that way. But people have busy lives. There's so much for people to consume now. Everyone is consuming their social media, the news, everything. And it's always been, it's a challenge to get people to think about animals because it makes people uncomfortable. And I think we know that most people think they are decent people. And I think our job is to get people to align their beliefs with their actions. And I think it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier, where once you are confronted with something, it should be very difficult to turn your back on it. And for some people, seeing animal cruelty footage is what gets them to be like, my God, like, this is the worst thing. I don't want to be complicit in that. But you're right, for some people that completely turns them off. And then for those people, we'll maybe do an opinion piece for them to read, in a newspaper, or we have a protest that, maybe happens in someone's local area that's funny, or we'll maybe have, a slightly sexier visual for another group of people. So I think for us, our strategy is using every resource we have to reach as many people as we can, in as many different ways as possible, to find what sticks, to convert that sort of one extra person into realizing how animals are treated.
Do you find that you sometimes make more enemies in the process, though? I'm not saying you do. I'm just genuinely curious. Like, so when you go on Good Morning Britain, I think on the one hand, it's actually good to be a conversation starter. You're not going to reach out to everyone that's watching. But what is your approach? Because there are risks, surely, with playing into the stereotype that PETA is set up to be, whether that's fairly or not. The idea of just being, picking the wrong battles, or, focusing on the wrong aspects. Like, people would say, we do need to get better care of animals, but, having discussions about whether we call pets or, regard them in that way. Really interesting discussion, which I'm sure we'll get to a bit later. But just on the idea of the optics of it, do you find there's a trap to fall into there?
So, PETA is never afraid of pushing the envelope and sort of, generating discussion. And I think when it comes to any social justice cause, it's not controversy that's their biggest enemy. Like, it is silence. And that's why when we're invited onto Good Morning Britain, or whatever TV show it might be, and it's not to talk about, say, a new investigation we had into a so-called free-range farm, or it's not an investigation into the Thai coconut monkey industry, or it's not our new SeaWorld footage that we have. They've picked up on one tweet that we did about animal-friendly language, which of course is important in the overall discussion. But we're a charity, and we're a small charity. We don't have the budget to be putting these ads anywhere we want. So we take every opportunity, even if we know that opportunity, potentially might cause some people to be uncomfortable or to lash out. And I think what I learned personally from doing the interviews about animal-friendly language and the idioms and that sort of thing, most of the messages I got from people were messages saying, I don't completely agree with what you're saying, but the way that you said it, I understood, and I appreciated the way that you explained it and how you held yourself. And I think when people realize that it's coming from someone who has, an argument to back it up or points to back it up, and that it comes from a place of compassion where we all just want a better life for the animals that, we share the planet with, then it is hard to disagree. And actually a former politician, Tony Benn, said it perfectly about social justice movements, where first people ignore you, then they think you're mad, then they think you're dangerous, and then there's a pause. And then it's a struggle to find someone who disagrees with you. And I think that's really true. And it does just take time to get people on board. But, there's always hope.
So what is the process with Good Morning Britain? Is it that they see a tweet that you've done and then they contact and say, would you like to respond to this? Like, what is the setup? Do they just say, this is what we want to talk about? Or
so with Good Morning Britain, it was always actually Piers who spotted the tweets, and he would then retweet it, and then we would get a call being like, Piers wants to have someone on to discuss it. And so I've been on twice. Once was in the studio with him, and then once was over Zoom at the start of this year. And both were exactly, well, you saw, I don't know if you've seen both of them, but you saw the most recent one. Yeah, so it's a bit of a shouting match, but I think it was still so beneficial for us to even just have animals being talked about in that way on such a huge platform. And it definitely, the response overall was incredibly positive. But in general for PETA, it is very difficult to get the more hard-hitting investigations. For example, we did an investigation into PETA Asia did an investigation into the UK wool industry, and we had this horrific footage where, sheep were being kicked, stamped on, the shearers are paid by the volume, so it's this incredibly quick process where these sheep are just treated like commodities, and none of the TV stations in the UK would show the footage. So then, we had a brainstorm, and we were like, right, what can we do to get this in the public eye? And that's when we went to the Village of Wool in Dorset, and we wrote a letter to the town council asking them to change their name to Vegan Wool. And of course, that was, it blew up. It was huge.
Yes.
We were invited onto every single TV station. We were on Sky News. We were on This Morning or Good Morning Britain, one of the two. It was everywhere. It went completely viral. And it was completely free. We sent one letter. We generated all this press coverage, and the hits we were getting to the PETA website from that video were huge. And people were learning about how sheep suffer for wool, which is something that I think is, it's definitely one of those campaigns that people are still sort of struggling to get their heads around a bit, because you think of these sort of idyllic tiny sheep farms, and I think that's a perfect example of how PETA will, we will try with the footage, and then if that doesn't work, we will come up with a PR stunt, something clever, something, potentially that could be deemed controversial or whatever. But it's because it works, and it gets people to the website, and it gets people talking about animals, and that's the goal. So
my next question, which you've answered already, was, do you sometimes bait the media with obnoxious requests? I will say, like the vegan wool thing. Clearly you do, and it works. And recently, I think it was last week, you turned up in was it crocodile?
Yes, it was a crocodile.
You had a crocodile costume with a cool crocodile mask, and the Sun was there doing footage of you doing this protest. Do you tip the Sun beforehand?
Yeah, so whenever we do sort of demos and actions like that, it's my job to invite. So I'm in charge of sort of most of PETA UK's press operations. So we send out a media alert that invites local photographers or newspapers or camera crews, news wires, photographers, all of that down to cover the action. And then, we keep our fingers crossed that people turn up, which thankfully they did for that one, which was brilliant, because a lot of people are still unaware that Hermes and other sort of high fashion brands still use crocodile and snakeskin and exotic skins like that. So yeah, it was really great actually to have that picked up by a national paper.
And do you think that there is a growing, I'm not going to say consensus, but are there increasingly more allies towards animal rights within the media establishment? Do you think that more and more journalists are on your side? Because I think traditionally they would be just like, no, we live the way that we do and forget it. Do you think that a lot of journalists that work for these media organisations are sympathetic to the plight of PETA?
Yeah, I've actually always found, ever since I first started at PETA, that there are always sympathetic journalists. And I think a lot of people have different campaigns that they, feel more invested in, that people maybe want to support us with more. But I think generally when it comes to the media, like you have to have a story for them. And I think that's why for our visuals and our protests, we try all tactics. We'll try something very gory and, fake blood everywhere, or we sort of do the slightly more, where it's appropriate, a slightly sexier visual, or, a mass scale protest with lots of different people. So yeah, it's all about just coming up with a great news story, really. And I think that will sort of take precedent over how much someone has a personal interest in it. But there are definitely a lot of sympathetic journalists out there who are lovely.
So what's the PETA recipe for fake blood? Do you have a special recipe?
I don't actually know. So I don't. So it's the campaigns team who does all the fake blood, and I'm not actually sure how they get it right.
You don't have like your own warehouse for it, because PETA uses a lot of fake blood, it seems. So I just assume you have this standby vat of it.
No, we actually don't use it all that often. It's usually. yeah, it's usually used quite sparingly, I'd say, actually, especially nowadays.
Extinction Rebellion are using it a lot now these days anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, they certainly know how to go all out when it comes to an action. But again, a good example of people doing things and getting in the headlines. So
So the driving force behind PETA and, looking for the welfare of animals, it is ethically driven. But is it ethically driven on the basis of what is ethically right for the animals, or is it seen as what is ethically right for humans as well? And what I mean by that is, like, when we look at, the meat industry and the impact it's having on climate change, is that something that PETA is leaning more into, or has it always been, well, regardless of, climate change or what might be good for us as humans, it's actually more about just the ethical standpoint that, sentient beings don't have a voice and they are therefore vulnerable, and we should not exert power that puts them under threat?
yeah, I mean, even sort of beyond protecting animal welfare, PETA is wanting to establish and protect the very rights of animals and trying to get animals rights where they may have none, to get them out of some of the horrific situations they're in. And of course, when Ingrid Newkirk founded PETA, sort of 40 odd years ago, the main focus was to get animals out of horrific situations that they were in, and to get people to think of how we treat these animals. But of course, you have to use all of the sort of resources that you have, and whether that's getting people to think about their own health, for example. When the World Health Organization released the report about processed meat being a carcinogenic, of course, that's something that we are going to use to encourage people to consider going vegan or vegetarian, because of course, whilst in an ideal world it would be, because people have empathy and compassion for animals, but at the same time, ultimately, it still helps animals regardless of the reason why someone goes vegan. So the fact that the meat and dairy industries are having such a detrimental effect on the environment, and that climate change is something that is being so hugely discussed at the moment, of course, that is something that we are also going to use to push the argument that we shouldn't be eating animals. And I think it's an argument that very few people can disagree with, given how much evidence there is, given that we have the United Nations saying that we need to cut down our meat intake by as much as 90%. These are all statistics that we are going to use. But of course, we also bring it back to the animals. And, we would also like to talk about how a cow would suffer from day one to ending up in the slaughterhouse, and to get someone to think of them as an individual, or mother cows on dairy farms. So that's, I guess, where we differ. We do always bring it back to the animals, but we do also use all the other resources that we can as well.
Is everyone who works at PETA a vegan?
Yes, I think pretty much everyone is, or at least vegetarian, sort of moving towards veganism.
So there's no absolution with it. Like, there's no, when you do your job interview, you're not going to tick that you're a vegan.
I mean, I'd be very surprised if you would want to work at PETA, but I'm pretty sure if someone started at PETA and they weren't vegan, they would definitely leave a vegan, because when you watch as much animal cruelty footage and see as much as we do, it'd be almost impossible, I think, to not be affected by that.
For sure. And I was being slightly facetious, but you make a really good point about the once you're aware of it, it's really hard to partake in those activities. So, I mean, I've spoken about this before. I am not vegan, I'm not vegetarian, but a lot of my fridge and kitchen is vegan products. I'm trying to get there. It's going to take me a while, but progress is progress. But one of the big turning points for me was a documentary called Food Inc. Have you seen Food Inc?
Yeah, I saw it a while ago, I think.
Yeah,
but I did watch it.
Yeah, and that movie really blew me away. And what I loved about it was the premise was not you should be vegetarian or you should be vegan. It was just posing the simple question, don't we have a right to know what's in our food? Because it's what we put inside us. That's a very intimate thing to do, and we should be better educated. And it talks about a slaughterhouse, I call it a slaughter factory, in Tar Heel, North Carolina, which, whenever the documentary was made, I'm having a look now actually, Food Inc. It was out in 2008. So when the film came out, they were talking about this slaughter factory in Tar Heel, North Carolina, and it slaughtered every day 30,000 pigs. I think it was more than that. And so when you pose that to people, it's just like, regardless, and I'm not saying we should brush it aside, but the ethical thing is, of course, a big thing. But regardless of the ethical argument, it's not sustainable. It's actually gross to think that, because I say straight away, well, 30,000 pigs, that's when they're slaughtered. How many days is it for them to get of age that they're slaughtered? Well, you times that by 30,000, it's absolutely obscene. And there were a lot of examples in that movie that once I saw it, I was just like, ugh. And I used to love bacon. I don't eat pork anymore. I used to have pork in all my burritos. I don't have that anymore, and I don't miss it. I don't miss it. And the biggest test for me was pigs in blankets at Christmas time with my family. As much as the bowl looked, appealing, didn't get involved with it, and the appetite wasn't there. But I have interesting conversations like with my mother because she loves making roast dinners. Her family's from Yorkshire, so there's going to be that sort of element there. And I sort of say to my mum, like, you should check out this documentary. She's like, oh, I don't want to see that. And I totally get it. And I think the main fear a lot of people have when it comes to this issue, and I can't speak for my mum, I can only assume, is kind of a concern I had, which is it's the idea that when you discover the unethical premise to the food that's on your plate, you're gonna be put off eating it, but you're gonna miss eating it, and it's gonna be really hard not to eat it. Whereas what I have found is actually, no, when you see the unethical premise of how food gets to your plate, you don't miss it. You actually get put off it, and you feel proactive in looking for alternatives. And so, yeah, that was a really powerful movie for me. And as I said, the only meat I eat these days now is chicken. And I eat a lot of meat substitutes. I think of like Aldi, their frozen section, every few months they've got another vegan section. And even the other week I had they had frozen hot dogs. I've never eaten hot dogs since I was a kid, and I was like, these vegan ones, let's try it. And that's part of the fun of being vegan. It's like, oh, let's try this and see how it compares. I couldn't believe it tasted like, and it probably, people say, oh, it's got no meat in it. It's like, well, do regular hot dogs have just meat in it and stuff like that?
You would not want to know what's in those ones.
Right, exactly. So when did you become vegan?
So it was probably maybe like 6 months before my internship started with PETA. So it was still quite early days, really, because I went from vegetarian to vegan, but it didn't happen overnight for me.
Sure.
I would have these sort of like cheat meals, which I cringe about now because obviously I was like cheating my morals where, it would be like where I'd allow myself to have like a cheese pizza or something like once a month, which, now I'm just like, oh, what strange logic.
Cheese is a difficult one.
Yeah, but equally, it worked in the sense that, I didn't do something sort of drastic overnight, which, to be honest, I think nowadays you could do. I mean, 6 years ago, it was quite a different field in terms of being vegan. I think there was maybe one vegan cheese, and there was maybe, oat milk didn't exist back then, I don't think. I think it was just soy milk and stuff. So it definitely, it was a bit of a slower journey. But then when I moved to London, and especially working in a vegan office, people would be bringing things in for their lunches, or I'd look in the kitchen cupboard and I'd be like, oh my goodness, like I had no idea that was vegan, or like asking people where they bought things. And we would always do these like potluck things where everyone would make something at home and bring it in, and then we'd all have like a big lunch, sharing the food. And it was just so insightful and interesting just to see how much you can eat. And it really just sort of put into perspective for me that being vegan, like, it's so easy, and nowadays it's even easier. I mean, the fact that I can order like a cheesy, like meaty like pizza from like Papa John's, and I can eat Ben and Jerry's ice cream, and I can even go to McDonald's soon and get their new McPlant burger. I mean,
are they doing that? Is that coming in?
Yeah, in October they're launching.
I was wondering when
it.
they were. I was like, McDonald's sooner or later are going to have to make this move. So
I know they've taken their time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, it really is incredible how many amazing vegan food options there are. And I think just going sort of back quickly to perceptions people might have of PETA, I think something that people don't realize is how much we do behind the scenes in terms of, we have a team of scientists. PETA US is an amazing team of lawyers who do incredible litigation work for animals. And in the UK, we have an amazing corporate team who works behind the scenes with food production companies and big brands. And, that's one of the main reasons why there's a Greg's vegan sausage roll. It's because of PETA's corporate team posing that to them, setting up a petition, getting them to do it. And that was one of the biggest food launches I think we've seen in recent years, was the vegan sausage roll. And I think, it's stuff like that I wish I could get people to see more of as well. So.
That's awesome. I didn't know the involvement with the Greg's vegan sausage roll, which I've still not had, but I've heard wonderful, wonderful things about it. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, we'll have to get you on.
London is so good for. I mean, I love watching your Instagram stories of every time you post your vegan foods and stuff, and like just the stuff you can get now that's vegan is amazing. I'm with you about like pizzas are definitely getting better. The cheese is getting better. Cheese is the one thing I would struggle with most still, although I have found great alternatives. I just wish it was more prevalent, and it's the worst phrase to use when you're talking about veganism, but I use it all the time. It's the chicken or egg about you want demand to go up for veganism, because then they will create a better vegan range, and that will bring more people in as well. My friend Rao Reynolds from Ennett Shikari, he's been a guest on the show before. He mentioned to me that when he went from vegetarian to veganism, that one of the toughest things to let go of was halloumi, which I totally understand, because halloumi is a good meat substitute because it has that texture. And so to go from that to vegan can be a challenge. And I remember I asked him, I was like, stupid question, if I give up like cow milk, what do you put on your cereal? And he was like, oh, that's easy. And he was like, and he listed them all. And like, that might sound like the most obvious question ever, but someone like me who felt was relatively informed, this was like 6 years ago now, it was there in front of me and I just didn't know, and having that recommendation made me try it. And now I get, it's the brand's called, I think, Koko. It's this sort of coconut milk solution that I think only Waitrose does it, and that's the only time I shop at Waitrose is to get that particular milk, and it's really, really good. And so but I do take this approach where, although I eat mainly vegan products, if I go somewhere and I'm given meat and stuff, I won't turn it down. Like, I'll have it, not to be wasteful and stuff like that, which I hear is a Buddhist sort of perspective. Like, they have their own values of what they eat, but if it's offered, they won't waste it. Obviously, there are limits to that, like foie gras and stuff like that I would never touch. So I assume you've been to Temple of Satan in London.
Yes. Oh my goodness. There's actually one that's opened up quite near me now in Brixton. And it's been dangerous. Like, I went through a stage, I think, of ordering it like once a week or something.
You explain it to the audience, Temple of Satan, because I love it.
So it's literally like your sort of typical London chicken shop, except everything is vegan. So it's seitan, which is like a sort of wheat protein that is beautifully deep fried and battered. And they do like the burgers, or you can get like sort of wings, or like drumsticks, or like nuggets, popcorn sort of style chicken. And they do amazing milkshakes actually as well. It's just reminded me.
Oh, I've not had a milkshake yet.
Yeah, they do amazing like desserts and everything. So I would highly recommend anyone who enjoys fried chicken to give Temple of Satan a go, because it's amazing. But also Linda McCartney, the food brand, they do like a chicken bucket that you can buy at the supermarket that's all vegan fried chicken, which also tastes really good if you don't want to get like the takeaway. But something I love about Temple of Satan as well is that it's so affordable. I think, it's vegan food obviously has all different price points.
Is this the bucket?
That's the chicken bucket. It's huge. Like, that's like 3 meals worth of chicken.
It's half a kilogram, yeah.
But it's so good. Vegan chicken is something that has definitely come into a world of its own, especially I think since KFC launched the Imposter Burger, which I think was about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago now. And that was pretty incredible as well, the fact that KFC, and that was something else that our corporate team sort of worked behind the scenes on. So
the one I liked at Temple of Satan was the mac and cheese.
Oh yeah, the mac and
I
cheese is so
That was the first time I had like vegan cheese that I thought that tastes amazing. Now, one of my friends who had it when I went for my birthday said, doesn't taste exactly like mac and cheese, and I was like, it doesn't, but I think that's the mindset we need to get our heads out of, which is vegan isn't trying to replicate meat exactly. And it's the whole discussion of like, why do you call it like a vegan beef burger when there's no beef in it? And it's like, well, it's a way of explaining to people, if you like that kind of thing, this is the closest to it.
Yeah, I always find the funniest thing that I feel I probably get asked on like most interviews about vegan food. It's like, why do vegans want to eat something that is called like a burger or like a sausage or whatever? Like, why don't you just eat like vegetables? And I'm constantly having to sort of reassure people, like, people often don't go vegan or vegetarian because they don't like the taste of things. It's because they don't want to be complicit in the suffering of animals. So of course, if there is an alternative that you can eat that doesn't include that suffering, then of course we're going to grab it with both hands. Like, we all want to enjoy our food, and I think that's something that people also struggle with. It's that sort of emotional attachment and nostalgia that you have to a lot of foods, like what you were saying about Christmas. A lot of people do have that idea of what that traditional Christmas dinner is, and now we're so fortunate that you can get vegan pigs and blankets. You can get like a vegan turkey roast, and there now doesn't have to even be that sort of not sacrifice, but that exchange. It's like you can have it all now and protect animals. So it really is a great time, I think, for anyone to give it a try, because there's just nothing to lose in that sense.
So you were talking about PETA has obviously a big team, including like researchers and stuff. Is a component of that looking at trends in terms of technology? I mean, I have a huge interest in futurism, because I did a video on my YouTube channel about maybe 7-8 years ago called The Ethical Meat Eater. Obviously, the title was to make people go, oh, what's that about? And it was the idea of 3D printing and obviously lab-grown meat, which is now becoming more prominent. When the first burgers were grown in a lab, they cost like $1.5 million to make, which is a bit more expensive than people are probably willing to pay for a lunchtime burger.
Probably.
Yeah. But it is obviously with mass production, and what you're saying about McDonald's is interesting, because I feel like those are the brands that you need to be doing vegan stuff, because they're going to get the cost per unit down from mass production. I just feel that in the next 10 years, there is going to be this kind of like turnkey moment where it's just going to switch, where when people are offered the choice of, you can have this and this, they taste the same, one has been from a killed animal, one isn't, I think people are just going to go for the vegan option. But at the moment, they're just waiting for those, the brands that they buy into, like McDonald's, actually giving them an offering that is good. But do you feel that it's going to be a sort of tapering off slowly? Or I've asked two questions there. One, do you look at the future trends of that, of like technology, and two, if that is the case, do you feel it's going to be something that slowly switches, or do you think there is going to be a turnkey moment?
Yeah, I think the whole future of lab grown meat is something that PTUS and PTUK, we do keep an eye on, and it is something we're asked about quite a lot, because I think people, because it does come from sort of animal cells, or at the moment I think some come from this calf serum, which is not harvested very nicely, what the sort of ethical issue is there, and whether would a vegan eat something like that. And I think the whole purpose of those burgers, as you say, it's not really to appeal to vegans or to people who are, already not eating meat. It is to appeal to those people who could just choose to have that instead of the one that the animal died for. But even bigger than that, it's the sustainability issue. And I think if you can grow these burgers in labs, and there's, the carbon dioxide emissions are cut and CO2 and all of that's down, like soon it might not even be a choice. Like it will just be lab grown meat. And when you think of the millions of animals that will save every year, it should be a no brainer for people. And as you say, they will taste exactly the same. So
yeah, it really is just a matter of time. And yeah, when I did my video, it was just about the 3D printing, but obviously lab grown is, and it is the thing that's sort of taken hold at the moment. But no doubt 3D printing, where it's just the atomic structure we're able to replicate, which will be the most ethical choice, because you won't need to extract from animals, as you mentioned. And the pushback when I did that video, and I think it's still a pushback you hear often these days, is the idea of it's not natural. And for me, it's like, but you have an animal that's in cramped, unnatural conditions that is bred with hormones, or, you know, you have chickens that aren't able to stand up because they've just been bred to be the biggest, that aren't able to support their own body weight. Like, when we educate people on that, I think that is how you can make the argument. And I think what will make people switch, it's when you you tell them the bad stuff about the current meat industry, but if they have nowhere to go, you know, like, how do I, you know, if the choice isn't there to make the ethical decision, then people feel trapped. And I think that's where there's the most pushback.
Yeah, and I think it's so true. There is nothing natural about how animals are farmed or how they're killed or the lives that they lead. You know, most animals are killed before they're even 6 months old, you know, in the meat industry. And I think that's something that for a lot of people, as you say, without that sort of alternative there, which, I mean, the alternatives are there, but I suppose for some people it's maybe an issue of cost, or it's an issue of accessibility, or you know, whatever it might be. But I do think the more product launches we're seeing, the more food on shelves, you know, even the fact that we've just gone through a pandemic, which, you know, was allegedly started at this wet market in Wuhan, you know, our treatment of animals is causing us huge problems. And, you know, it's not just the coronavirus, it's, you know, swine flu, bird flu, MERS, SARS, you know, I mean, there's been so many zoonotic diseases, which are so detrimental to human health as well, that really it's not sustainable for that reason either, for us to keep treating animals like that. And I think at the end of the day, that, you know, nothing is worth that fleeting moment of taste, no amount of suffering. But yeah, I do hope that, you know, whether people find out through PETA or through however it is, or, you know, even like something that I sort of did when I first went vegan, you know, if I was going to like a friend's birthday or something, like I would bake a vegan cake, and you could never tell that the cake was vegan. But, you know, once people are like, oh, this cake is so nice, you know, then I'd maybe be like, oh, well, did you know, like, there's no eggs or like milk or butter in it? And then people are like, oh my goodness, like, would never have known that. And it's those kind of ways where I think you can kind of show people that, you know, there's nothing to miss out on. You can still have all of the taste and the texture of the foods you like, but it just doesn't have to come at the cost of animals. So
what's the ethical stance? I mean, it could be for you personally or PETA as an organisation, when it comes to like eggs that, you know, people have from like chickens that have been saved from, you know, battery farms and stuff. There are people, I can't remember what the term is, but there are people, is it just like rescue chickens? So is that something that is supported? Like, is that seen as a good thing? Or
I think the problem is anything that sort of seems like it's not sustainable for the amount of eggs that Britain eats for everyone to be getting their eggs.
Definitely.
So of course people see that it's okay for that, and then they'll go to the supermarket and then they'll be like, oh, well, these are free range eggs, so we'll just get those. And I think the problem is that if it's deemed sort of more acceptable to be eating eggs overall, then people will continue to buy eggs that have like labels, which we know are there to make consumers feel better, not to make the animal welfare better. And we recently did an investigation into the Happy Egg company, and the footage from that, you know, was just absolutely horrific. Chickens, you know, barely able to get outside. They could barely spread a wing. There was dead chickens amongst the living. You know, some were resorting to cannibalism. You know, and it's not this sort of idyllic pasture that people imagine, you know, all these happy hens in. So, I mean, I think, of course, if we're talking a very small scale, like if you rescued a chicken and that chicken was laying eggs, if you didn't want to get rid of those eggs and ate them individually, you know, there isn't an issue there. But the problem is that it's sort of
that can't be scaled. Yeah,
like that. It's just not sustainable, and then people will continue to profit off that in the long run. And there's so many vegan egg alternatives now anyway. That of course the best option for chicken certainly is for people to get the vegan options.
A criticism of moving away from meat eating is the idea of, well, what happens to all these animals, like all these cows and pigs that we no longer need. Now, obviously, I think it's an absurd criticism. So, we should we should maintain, them living just so we can keep killing them in this cycle of pain and misery. But there would have to be a transition, a way of like, if we were to, stop meat eating, or if there was to be a day where it just drastically decreased. Is there a transition plan that in place of, farmers might just go, well, I can't afford to keep these anymore, so just going to kill them?
Yeah. No, I mean, of course.
Yeah.
I think, we are certainly realists. We know that nothing is going to happen overnight. And I suppose the long-term plan is the demand for vegan food, which is, better for the environment, better for human health, and better for animals. The more the demand rises for that, then the demand for meat and eggs and dairy, that will go down. And for the farmers who are in those industries, we've actually seen quite a few farmers turning away from farming cows for dairy milk and moving into oats or vegetables. And we actually did a competition not too long ago with Deborah Meaden from the Dragon's Den.
She's amazing. She is such a champion. Like at the moment, like the last 5 years, she has just really gone for it with sustainability and ethics around animals.
Yeah, no, she's so brilliant, and she offered as a sort of prize a consultation with a dairy farmer who was wanting to move away into different businesses. And the length of time we're talking about this happening, there'll be so much time for people to adapt with the times, and to change careers where people aren't suddenly going to be out of jobs and there's not going to be all these animals needing killed. It will happen gradually. And when you consider how many vegan businesses there are now compared to 5-10 years ago, it shows you how these things can change and how they can change quite quickly. So yeah, I mean, I think we're definitely going in a much more green and vegan direction. But as you say, it's not going to happen overnight.
It's not, but in a way, you do kind of want it to happen gradually, so there is a transition, as opposed to, because what I'm saying is I don't think it is going to happen overnight, but there is always a risk that due to economic conditions, or if there is a jump in technology, that it could really jolt the economy, especially where you've got these farms where they have 30,000 pigs they're killing a day, that suddenly it's we don't need this anymore. Do you know what I mean? There are risks, surely.
I mean, you see that if there's ever an outbreak of bird flu or disease, thousands of animals are culled, and that's something that it does happen. And I suppose from the animal's point of view, it doesn't matter if they're being killed because they're infected with a disease, or if they're being killed because the demand isn't there, or if they're being killed to go into supermarkets. At the end of the day, they're losing their lives for perceived human gain. So I think from the animal's perspective, it's irrelevant where they end up once they've died, really.
So animals are used in many different aspects of society, not just for food, but for their wool and material of their skin and what they shed, and also for research. I mean, you've had the COVID vaccine, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have.
And it's not vegan, is it?
No, it's not vegan.
And by the way, I'm not doing this this is not like a gotcha. This is just it's not this idea. I know there'll be people always, especially people like Piers Morgan. You're a hypocrite, and therefore anything you've ever communicated has no legs to stand on. I'm not one of these people. I do think it's an interesting, not necessarily dichotomy, but I think challenge we have as a species, which is, I think when we look at society as a whole, it's how do we alleviate, how do we prevent the most amount of potential suffering? And obviously COVID is causing mass suffering. There was a quick rollout of the program. It's not vegan. I don't actually know anything about the research process or what it was tested on. I don't know if you can speak to that, but I'm just curious to know what your views are on vaccines. And, clearly you've taken it even though it's not vegan, but there has to be a value judgment there.
So, I mean, all medication in the UK has to be tested on animals. So, unfortunately, any medication that you have will have gone through an unfortunate process. But I think when it comes to protecting animals, especially, PETA scientists, for example, they work tirelessly to get pharmaceutical companies, to get businesses, universities, food manufacturers to move away from animal testing, to move to in vitro methods, organs on a chip, and all of these.
Could you explain those two things you mentioned?
I mean,
not in huge detail.
I couldn't do it justice.
No. But what does that mean? I don't like. You said organs on a chip.
Yeah, there's viable testing methods which we know give more reliable results, rather than testing on animals, because of course animals are not furry little humans. There's been diseases which have been cured in animals for decades, which they still can't get to apply to humans because we don't have the same biology as them. Whereas organs on a chip, for example, they are designed to replicate the human body. Right. And that way we test things on them, and you get more reliable results. So, PETA science team works to do this, but in order for them to do their jobs the best they can, there is absolutely no benefit of them turning down a vaccine from a virus that could potentially kill them, especially when there is no alternative. And I think that's something that is the sort of the fundamentals of it. If there is no alternative, then of course you have to take what is best for you in terms of your health. I also have asthma, and if I stop taking my inhaler and had an asthma attack or something, I like to think I'm doing good work and that the animals benefit more from me being in this role and trying to educate people and communicate that message than it, would be if I died from not taking it. And I think that's the only way that we can move forward, is that if the people who are working in the right places and the right fields do what they can to continue that work. And unfortunately, until there is a vaccine that hasn't been tested on animals, which there might be at some stage soon, then obviously you would want that one. But if there is no choice to make, then, your hands are sort of tied there, really.
It is an unfortunate way that a lot of mainstream discourse is conducted around social issues, and what you say is really important, the idea that your objective is to enable progress and get us in the right direction. It's not about absolutes. And so when I think about the climate crisis, I mean, I could talk about a lot of things I believe with in life. So, I believe in like a post-capitalist society, more based on a resource-based economy. However, I feel the world that we live in now is what it is, and we need to find a good way of transitioning. So some people might go, well, I'm a hypocrite because I believe in ethics and compassion, but I have an iPhone, or, I still eat meat. And for me, it's like, but I'm not shaming people for making those same decisions as me. I'm just saying I believe in a better world and I want to get there. And it doesn't mean I'm going to be able to do it overnight. It's I'm working through these things bit by bit. And when you see discussions around climate change, the first thing they go to is, oh, they took a train which runs on fossil fuel, and Greta Thunberg has been incredible, the way that she uses so much renewable energy, like sailing around the world, and still that's not good enough for the people that are critics of her. But it is the fact that you can be for a better world and have an objective, and still live in a society that is at odds with that. I mean, that's the very nature of why we strive for progress. It's because we're not happy with the current conditions and we want to get to somewhere better.
Exactly. You've got to make the best decisions you can with what's available. And I think being a purist about anything certainly doesn't work that well. And like a good example was when, Burger King launched a vegan burger, but they cooked it on the same grill as the meat burgers. Sure. And, for some vegans, that was, that wasn't good enough. That was not a vegan burger. So then they wouldn't buy it, they wouldn't support it. Whereas I think a more pragmatic approach that I would certainly take, and that I know PETA more generally would take, is that, well, it doesn't help any more animals to not eat that vegan burger, but by choosing that vegan burger, you are increasing the demand for vegan foods, and it's opening up a market. But if every vegan boycotted this vegan product purely because it was just cooked on the same grill, then there might not be any demand for it, and then they might take it off the menu. So I think there's no point being a purist if it's not ultimately helping whichever cause it is that you're looking to help. And it's like, well, if me eating this doesn't actually make life worse for any more animals, then what's the problem? Especially if there's other benefits to it, you know. So yeah, I definitely think a more pragmatic view is the best way to sort of make these decisions.
I love that point you made actually about the burgers being cooked on the meat, and like, you know, it's the whole don't make the perfect enemy of the good. But it sort of goes back to the question I asked you quite near the start regarding the approach you take in the media when you create, you know, you engage in these conversations that are the most polarizing. And again, I'm not saying it's not the right way to do it. You've clearly made a lot of progress by taking that route. It's how you get the conversations out there, and the discussions. But isn't there a risk that the nuance, like that nuanced approach right there, is something I wouldn't, and look, this is just my perception, so I'm not here to say it's right. It's just that if I perceive this, then I'm sure there's a lot of other people that perceive it as well. That is not the kind of perspective I would have seen PETA as taking before I, you know, encountered you in interviews online. The idea, I would have thought PETA was like, no, it's cooked on a meat grill, therefore it's still suffering of animals, so you shouldn't do it at all. Like the perfect being the enemy of the good. That is a perspective I would have had on PETA until very recently.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Actually, that would be your perception.
So you don't think a lot of people have that perception, or?
I mean, I'm sure there are, you know, misconceptions about that. I think ultimately everything that PETA does is for the good of animals.
Sure. Yeah.
So it would definitely be what's not good for animals is if people didn't eat a vegan burger because it might be slightly tainted by something on a grill, because it doesn't increase the animal suffering, if you know what I mean. So I guess when we do things that would maybe be, you know, for example, we were actually just last weekend, we were in Weymouth at a seafood festival where we had a PETA activist dressed as a lobster on a plate. And the messaging was, you know, it's not what's on your plate, it's who's on your plate, and relate to who is on your plate. And, you know, for some people, they might think that that's like, oh, you know, that's too much, you know, especially as it was right next to all the lobsters. Yeah, oh, God, very speedy typing. Yeah, and sea life, not seafood, you know, that's a very simple message that gets across. You know, we're talking about individuals here.
Where do you get these costumes from, honestly? Like,
a very creative team is in charge of all of the costumes. But, you know, is that something that, would you think that was, you know, is that what you would associate with PETA? Or like, do you think that would be too polarizing or extreme, I suppose? I think you used that word earlier.
Yeah, I mean, that I think's great. I think it's good imagery. The lobster thing is just something that's always blown my mind. The idea that you boil them alive is just insane. And it's just something I've never understood, and felt, again, a bit of a weirdo being out of convention of, like, you be at a restaurant, everyone's happy with it. Like, I'll pick that lobster out, and I'm just like, what is wrong with people? But because it's the way things are. So yeah, like stuff like that I wouldn't find. And look, when I'm talking about like extremeness, I don't want to sort of go in the direction of saying I think PETA is an extreme organisation. I'm just talking about sort of the perceptions of when you have, you know, very violent imagery. And again, I'm not saying it's not effective. It's kind of why I'm posing these questions of what the, you know, you wouldn't be doing it unless it was having an impact. But again, going back, sorry, yeah.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, you know, the images that we share of animals are shocking and they are horrific, but it's because what's being done to these animals is shocking and horrific. So I suppose it kind of comes back to that, well, if you can't stomach seeing it, then you really should not be contributing to it. And whilst, yes, of course, that might upset some people, ultimately it will get them thinking, and it does just always go back to that pushing the envelope, and, you know, not sitting in silence and, you know, doing everything you can to make people aware of that suffering.
Yeah, I'm going to get back to the nuance bit again in a moment, but just on that point you just made there. In the UK, are there laws against filming inside slaughterhouses? I know in the US there's the whole thing about, you know, you're not allowed to fly drones over slaughter farms and that because of revealing. I mean, I think it was Paul McCartney who famously said if slaughterhouses were in glass houses, they'd be...
everyone would be vegetarian.
Vegetarian, yeah.
So we don't actually sort of do that many investigations ourselves into slaughterhouses, but I know that some of the other groups do. But I believe they are all undercover or sort of whistleblower type
Yes.
footage, or people who sort of work at the facilities that undercover would take the footage. But I think that is the perfect way of getting people to understand what goes on inside those awful places. And I think if you can't stomach something, then you shouldn't be eating them.
And you mentioned how PETA is, in all these different regions of the world. Are there just, when I think about like the transition to veganism as a culture, I think, technology is going to be one of the biggest proponents of that. I do think that education is absolutely key, and I think we'll get there. But ultimately, sort of the majority of the population is finding to come on side when technology allows for the mass production of vegan substitutes. But are there just some cultures where there's just so much more runway to go along? So I think of like in China where dogs are eaten, which is just something unbelievable. And yet, you can make the argument, well, people don't like the idea of dogs being eaten, but then pigs are more intelligent and you're fine with that. So there's these really interesting sort of intellectual contradictions or cognitive biases with the way that we perceive animals in different contexts with food. But you said there's a PETA in Asia. Like, whereabouts in Asia is that based?
In the Philippines.
Oh, in the Philippines, right.
Yeah.
And is it proactive across Asia, or is Philippines like the starting point of where there's the main
So
focus?
that's just where one of the offices is based,
Right.
but they do work over all of Asia. And then there's also, PETA India as well. But I do think most cultures have a lot of vegan foods already available, especially like in India, a lot of the staples happen to be vegan, and in Asia and in China as well. And I do think there's a lot of finger pointing at other cultures for things, like the dog meat markets and so
Sure.
on. And the point you made is exactly spot on. It's like, how can we point the fingers at other cultures just because those are the animals that we choose to keep in our homes, whereas our perception of pigs is that they're dirty or lazy or food. And I think that's a really interesting discussion whenever it is sort of that time of year when the dog meat markets are on.
Is veganism like a privileged lifestyle? Like, is it something that only those that can afford, stand by?
I mean, the basics of eating vegan are actually some of the cheapest foods. So like pasta, rice, bread, chips, crisps. A lot of vegetables can be bought very cheaply depending where you shop. But I think certainly when products, sort of more niche products, first started launching, like maybe some vegan cheeses or some of the vegan meat launches, of course they were slightly more expensive. And, of course, a lot of our sort of messaging about veganism, it's certainly not aimed at people who are living through food banks or who are struggling to eat on a daily basis. We're encouraging everyone, obviously, to make changes where they can. But at the same time, obviously eating, if you're under the poverty line, that has to be however you can. But I think nowadays, because price points have come down so much, because, as you said, like Aldi's shelves are absolutely lined with, or freezer aisles are lined with food, it's definitely so much more affordable now. But the staples have always been very, very cheap. When I first went vegan and was living in London and, not on a huge salary, I was eating like a lot of beans on toast and everything. And maybe it wasn't the most healthy, but, you can certainly make it work.
That's cool. I was just looking up a cartoon that was sort of a campaign poster. I don't know if you can recall this. It's an image of a cat a farmer is like preparing the food for the cat, and then there's loads of farm animals on the side, and they're all looking at the cat, and the cat's about to be fed the animals. I don't know if it's like I'm going to say it's famous, and I can't even recall it. But it normally when you get these these BuzzFeed listicles of like controversial campaign adverts. It's one of them on there. I can't find it at the moment. Maybe a listener or a viewer can tweet it to me afterwards. Although hopefully they tweet me the right one and not something else that's just going to gross me out. Because whenever you talk about these issues, different people can stomach different things. And I have a few vegan animal rights activist friends on my Instagram, and some of them on their stories every day will post some of the most horrific. There's one I can remember. It's of this little pig just like shivering and crying out in the middle of squalor, and it was just stayed with me. Can't unthink it. And obviously that's the impact, but I also feel that's not made me more of an ally. I was already on side. Maybe it will impact someone else, but again, I think that sometimes the imagery, if it's not contextualized or it's not connected to if you're presenting people with a problem and it's only a problem that they're now saying, here's the problem, okay, thank you, and it's not attached to any path to a solution, then that's what makes, I mentioned this earlier, it's what I think frustrates people, because it's like, okay, I've now been, loaded with shame and guilt, which some people might say, well, that's right, that's what people should feel, but then there's no way about it. And I feel that when I see a lot of that footage, which is, I'm already on the path to it, whereas a film like Food Inc. contextualizes it, and the opening scene of that documentary is amazing, because it literally shows a supermarket while the credits are rolling, and it has the things that you mentioned earlier, like it has, I think, like lamb in the packet, and on the front of it is like a farmer cuddling a sheep, all that propaganda. And the main point it starts with in the film is, we walk in these stores every week and we are so detached from nature. It doesn't matter what month of the year it is, it's the same fruit and veg on the shelves. It's, even if it's out of season, it's always there. And the meat that we get is in its packet. It doesn't even look like it's from an animal. It's just like, it's meat. It's not, you can get it on the bone, but it's like, it's not attached to an animal. So there is this sort of disconnect from nature and where food comes from. And I remember years ago being on a vacation with my family in France, and they had some friends who live in the middle of nowhere, like half an hour from any store. Amazing. I couldn't live there. But when we went to this supermarket, they had like all these chickens and that with their necks broken, like on the counter. And it sort of goes back to that discussion around the culture aspect in different parts of the world. There's no way that would pass in the UK. And yet there it is in France. It's just like, and I kind of, respect might not be the right word, but I kind of respect people that eat meat more in France, because they're shown this is where it's from and they're still making that decision. But saying that in the UK, you could argue kind of the opposite, which is, you kind of respect meat eaters in the UK more because they are more detached from it. They are less aware of, the fact that they know meat is from an animal, but it's very abstract. They don't actually know the process of, this is how it's come to be.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, is a huge part of our mission. It's getting people to join the dots. And I think so many different things work for different people. And especially now with social media, you can make a TikTok that's going to reach so many sort of more Gen Zs, for example, than millennials, and having that message come across in like a TikTok video, to them that will resonate so much more. Whereas to someone more my age, like the millennials, it might be a YouTube video that might be what I would happen to see more. And how it's portrayed, is it a heartfelt cartoon? For example, like we do quite a lot of the, or we did actually for a while, a lot of the Draw My Life videos, which I'm sure you will know, was, a huge thing on YouTube for ages. And for a lot of people, having the industry with an individual being able to, I guess it's kind of like Babe. A lot of people will have watched Babe and then they will have never wanted to eat pigs again because of that one individual. Whereas for other people like you, having that mass understanding of the scale of slaughter and that sort of unnatural element is what worked. And I think that's why now when we see documentaries coming out, they do sort of tend to move away from the the animals being at the core of it, like with the Game Changers, for example. I know so many male friends of mine watched Game Changers and were like, oh my goodness, like my like athletic performance could be better if I had a vegan diet, you know? And it had nothing to do with animals, and it
Yes.
encouraged people to eat you know, vegan foods. And nowadays you see so many athletes like Lewis Hamilton, David Hay, you know, either eating vegan full time or eating vegan sort of on the run up to fights or competitions or whatever it might be. And I think, you know, eating vegan, there are just so many ways to sort of promote and encourage people to do this, and so many benefits, and that there really is something for everyone. You just have to find, you know, that hook for someone, really.
It is, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's about looking at what is everyone's individual values and what they're trying to do in life and how can it serve them. But you also do need to do the cast the net wide approach with the media of like just getting the message out there and starting the conversations, and then you can do the more targeted sort of campaigns for people in different aspects of life. I was trying to remember a show I saw ages ago, and I've just found it on YouTube. It was The F Word with Gordon Ramsay, because I will never forget there was an episode where he went to a slaughterhouse, and I'm not going to play it now, but I've sort of got the video here where you have this pig that gets stunned and then slaughtered, and I think Janet Street Porter's there as well. And although I haven't watched it now, from what I remember years ago, there's a moment where they ask, is the pig all right? When it's like it's been stunned and like they don't want it to be in pain and stuff. And I remember, I don't know if it was this one or another one where Gordon Ramsay was seeing an animal being slaughtered, but he went really white in the face. And I found that really interesting. Like, you know, a chef that works with food all the time. Obviously, he still has gone back to working with meat. But having been in a slaughterhouse firsthand, I kind of feel like it needs to be a part of education. Like, I always talk about all the things I wish education had. I wish it had, like, you know, you got taught to cook in school. I didn't get taught relationships, consent, finances, civics.
Yeah.
But I think that when it comes to cooking, it should also be about like where your food comes from. And I saw a BuzzFeed video years ago of just in America, a group of kids were taken to a chicken farm, and they basically chose a chicken. They cut the throats and killed the chickens, and then they cooked it, and they made, I think, chicken nuggets and stuff. And I think at the end of it, they were asked, like, what do you think? And they're like, yeah, didn't realise where my food came from. I couldn't do this, but I'm still going to eat chicken. I think some of them said that, which I was kind of like, how? Because the rule I've always had, and this is where I will admit I am a hypocrite, because this is actually a value that I espouse, although I don't shame people for, because I don't live by this myself. But I think a good rule to have, and I know you're going to disagree with it, because the answer should be we shouldn't eat meat regardless. But I feel that if you aren't able to kill an animal yourself, you shouldn't eat it. Because there's this kind of like jurisdiction of duty, this side of like, well, it's done in a slaughterhouse, it's put on my plate, I don't sort of have to worry about that. And it's like, I can kill a pig or a chicken, break a chicken's neck, all this sort of stuff. And so I think it's a real it's a really bad reflection on me, the fact that, you know, I've been willing to be complicit just because I haven't had to deal with the horrible aspect of it, which is the whole aspect of it. An animal has been killed to provide you with sustenance. And
and I think most people couldn't do that. You know, I think 99% of the British public, I'm sure, would not be able to actually kill the animals that they eat. And unfortunately, you do actually see a lot of industries that treat animals as commodities, whether it's the meat industry or the leather industry. You know, the people who work in those environments, you know, they suffer from having to be around that. You know, so many slaughterhouse workers suffer from depression and poor mental health because of what they see every day. And then in Bangladesh, in the leather industry, you know, children are up to their knees in toxic chemicals, you know, tanning the leather hides and everything. So when you actually look at all these industries, I mean, not only are they horrific for the animals, but, you know, humans are not doing that well in them either. And we saw that especially during COVID. A lot of the worst affected sort of companies were things like meat processing plants, because of the environment that they were in, the sort of chilled atmosphere and all the obviously fluids and everything flying around. You know, the virus like spread like wildfire in those environments. And, unfortunately, a lot of people paid with their lives for that. So, I mean, these industries are just so incredibly damaging, for the environment, for animals, and for humans. And yeah, the mental toll of having to see animals go through that is immense.
Again, it's another great point I loved from the documentary Food Inc. It talked about it's not just about the exploitation of animals, it's the exploitation of a lot of immigrants that are illegally there and therefore don't have labour rights and are working in terrible conditions. And there was a whole piece about how there are regular raids done on these families that are on the border, but they don't actually raid too many because they know it would cause the factory to shut down because they wouldn't have the staff. So there's this kind of like collusion happening between the authorities and these massive food packing plants. But then it's also exploitation of the consumers because of when viruses get into the food supply, or the fact that in the US especially, there's this whole subsidization of corn syrup, which is used in everything from what the animals are fed to what is in drinks, and just it's so cheap that it's in everything, and obviously it's having a massive impact on physical health of the American population with everything they consume. So do you feel that when it comes to the alleviation of suffering of animals, that for PETA the biggest win, if I can call it that, is around transitioning away from meat eating? Is that where most animal suffering takes place?
I mean, it's very difficult to sort of quantify animal suffering in that way, but yeah, I mean, millions and billions of animals worldwide are, slaughtered every year. So I think PETA's main campaign is encouraging people to live a vegan lifestyle, which obviously infiltrates all aspects of life. So whether that's buying vegan cosmetics or wearing vegan leather, vegan wool, those sorts of things. Not going to circuses or roadside zoos or marine parks. Overall just living a life which I guess is minimizing the amount of harm you cause to the best of your abilities. So I think it's not like, well, if you don't eat meat, you can then do other things, know?
I get it.
It's a holistic lifestyle and view. But of course, you can also take steps. Everything doesn't have to happen at once. But I think, of course, encouraging people to not eat animals is a huge step. But I think what we normally see is that people will be endeared by another campaign. So, for example, like a lot of people don't like, cosmetics testing on animals or something. That's quite an easy one for people to be like, no, this shouldn't be happening. This is awful. It's for makeup. We can buy cruelty-free cosmetics. So then when people open their eyes to that, or like, for example, with the Blackfish documentary, that opened my eyes to animal suffering in a way that I just had not even considered. And that was before I went vegan. But once I started emphasizing with those animals, it then made it so much easier for me to then imagine how other animals might be feeling who are, being treated. So I do think if you can get people on board with one issue, then it tends to open up people's eyes to all the other ways that animals are suffering.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when it comes to going back to PETA as an organisation, what do you feel? I mean, I've already expressed some of my own, but what do you feel when you're going out there doing your work are the biggest misconceptions about PETA as an organisation? In what ways are PETA misunderstood, if at all? I assume you do think you are misunderstood in some ways.
It's tricky. I mean, I guess because I've been at PETA for so long, and I guess all my friends and family have known me to be at PETA for so long, I feel that, I suppose on a day-to-day basis, I just feel like people, they get what we're doing. We know that, they know that we're an organization which loves animals and that we're a charity which puts animals in the forefront of their minds. And I think that people potentially feel they don't need to agree with us on everything, but they can still support us on the things that they do agree with. So I would certainly hope that, that's how people perceive us. And I guess the main misconception that I guess we sort of touched on earlier is how, I think a lot of people think maybe we do just do the big PR stunts, or the crocodile demo I did the other week, that's very PETA, and they don't actually realize a lot of the very serious work that we do behind the scenes, and like the change that we another thing our corporate team focuses on is like fashion. And one of the main reasons that there is almost no fur on the British high street now is thanks to PETA. And I think that's something that, probably no one's going to write a headline about us for doing that. But that's something that, that we know that we've done, and our supporters know that we've done. And I think if people actually took the time to go to the PETA website and watch our investigations or see what we do, because we do publish all of it, all of this is available for people. But I think, if all you're seeing is like the clip in The Sun, for example, that was on my Instagram, you maybe don't understand fully why, how we got to that stage, sort of thing.
And like in America, a big part of PETA's strategy is, I don't know if they have just one or they have they have animal shelters, right?
Yeah, there's one shelter that's operated out of Norfolk in Virginia.
As soon as you say Norfolk, it's like straight away I'm like, oh, that's a UK place. Like, the amount of,
I know.
Like having a Reading, like I'm in Reading, and they have a Reading in the States. So I'm sure they have many. But do we have shelter? Does PETA have shelters here? Or... No,
we don't. We don't do any sort of welfare work like that in the UK.
And is that animal welfare work just in the US, or is it done in other regions of the world? I assume.
So it's done. So in the Philippines, there's a group called Pasay Pups, which does a lot of work with the stray animals on the ground there. So it tends to be in the countries that have a lot more stray animals who need to be spayed or neutered, or who need food and water. It's the same in India. There's a sanctuary that PETA works with who rescues a lot of the bulls and cows that are used as working animals over there, and donkeys as well, and they'll rehabilitate them. But in the UK, there are so many other groups who sort of do that good work. And also we don't have the same issue of animals sort of being on the streets as much here.
That is true. I'm always really surprised when you see like stray animals. I remember seeing Louis Theroux's documentary I think it was in California. And obviously a lot of people get pets and then can't look after them. And so they just let them go and they're just running around. And I'm sure there's been a big issue with... shelters filling up with the pandemic, people getting pets and then realizing actually they can't. And it goes to the point that you're mentioning on television about, the idea of ownership of pets, and, people feel they're just something you can have as a toy. And then when you don't want them, you can just, do you have any pets?
So I used to have a cat. He lived with my parents in Edinburgh, though, when I moved down to London. So we had him for 18 years.
Wow.
So a very long time. But I wouldn't look to adopt an animal quite yet, I don't think, just given my sort of renting situation in London. But it is great, actually, at the PETA office, people can bring in their animal companions. So we often have quite a lot of dogs at the office, which is lovely.
So you call them animal companions and not pets? Just to be clear.
I would.
And explain that. I mean, I've seen the interview, but for the listeners and that, it's because pet is it's associated with ownership. Is that what it's about?
Yeah, it's the word pet also sort of combined with the word it. Like if you call an animal an it sort of makes them seem like a table or a chair.
Right.
And pet, it gives that sort of sense of ownership. Whereas really, they're so much more than that. These are like individuals who you bring into your home to be part of your family. So whilst, we're certainly not saying that those words should be banned, it is, we are sort of saying, well, there's actually an alternative which you might find is actually more appropriate, because I think a lot of people do think of these animals as their companions, but obviously just the word pet is thrown around so often, it's a word we've always used. But that being said, just because something has always been used does not mean that, you can't move away from things. Language is always evolving. And I think given the homelessness crisis for animals in the UK especially, anything we can do that gets people to understand that these are living beings who are a huge responsibility. You need to make sure you're financially in the right place, that you've got the time, the love, the ability to care for these animals, the more we can get people to really make that connection, then hopefully the less animals that you would see ending up in shelters, or needing sort of euthanized or being abandoned or discarded.
Yeah, as soon as you mention companion, I'm like, yeah, that's nice. I like it. And I know that obviously in the debate with Piers Morgan, it's like, so I can't say pet, and all this sort of stuff. And it is interesting because you can take it from two ways. There will be people that are like, why am I being told? It's like, no, just consider it. Like, yeah, it's nice to call them a companion. I'm like, no big deal. Like, and I might call them a pet occasionally, but like I do prefer companion. And it's definitely my experience. My brother has a dog called Theo, who is absolutely adorable. I'm terrible with breeds. I'm going to say it's a Cavachon, but absolutely adorable. But I get the best of both worlds, where I get to take him for walks occasionally, but then I can also pass him back to my brother, and not deal with having him running around. I mean, with the way that I live my life, I can never have a pet, because I don't think it'd be right for the animal. I wouldn't be able to give it the home it deserves, and at least looking after my brother's dog has really made me understand the in-depth connection people have, especially with dog owners. When you see a lot of grown adults absolutely devastated when losing their dogs. I've always understood, it's sad to lose a pet, but it was only when with Theo that I can now see how deep that connection is. And it all comes back to the loyalty they show and the unconditional love. It's just, dogs are just incredibly special.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's some people who they don't realize the commitment that they're taking on. And I think also something that we really encourage people to do, if they do feel like they're ready to bring any animal, whether it's a dog, a cat, even a goldfish, would be to look at their local adoption shelters first, because so many animals end up in shelters, and a lot of them do have to get euthanized because they don't find their forever home. And then on the flip side, you have breeders who are, churning out puppies to make profits on, and they're just, every puppy that's born into the world, then a shelter dog really does lose their chance of finding that home. So I think something that everyone could do to help save an animal's life is to always consider adoption.
And in America, when it comes to shelters, is there something called like a no-kill policy?
Yeah, so the scene in America is very different to what it's like in the UK, and there is a huge no-kill movement, which basically means that you could take an animal who was dying, who was riddled with cancerous tumors, had absolutely no hope at recovering from that disease, and a shelter would refuse to euthanize them, because it would affect obviously their euthanasia statistics, and they don't want to be a kill shelter. So animals are turned away from having a dignified and peaceful death from a lot of shelters. And also it means that animals are often kept at these shelters in very crowded and poor conditions, but they're so determined to not have that perception of being a kill shelter that they will just leave them to languish in that state. Whereas what PETA offers in the US is a sort of shelter of last resort, where if an animal is dying, or is mentally in a position where they could never be rehomed because they're incredibly aggressive after being treated so terribly their whole lives, PETA does take in those animals to give them a peaceful death. And I've actually been out to Norfolk, Virginia, and I've done a trip with the team there out into the impoverished communities that they work in. And again, the scene is incredibly different to anything you could imagine in the UK, because over there, it's very much, you have outside dogs. So big dogs like pit bulls and Labradors, any sort of big dog is an outside dog. And often they are also used as guard dogs. And unfortunately, because these communities are so impoverished, they don't have many possessions. But something that they can have is a dog. But that often means that the dog is not treated well. People can barely afford to feed themselves. So, of course, getting dog food is not a priority. So what PETA's team does, and what I did when I went out there, was deliver food, hay bales, dog houses, which are custom made for the dogs as well, to try and improve the quality of life that those animals have out there. And then, of course, we also, or they would also try and get any dogs relinquished to them that could be rehomed, or dogs who are dying and who need to sort of have that alleviation of suffering.
Again, it reminded me of this Louis through the documentary and I was just looking up the details. So it was called Life, LA Stories, Life in the City of Dogs. And it was it looking at the scattering of LA's 8 million canines. That's roughly 2 for every human. And there was this one shelter. And again, it's kind of what we're talking about with the food industry. It's not just about the abuse of the animals. It's also the abuse and the vulnerability of the workers. And at this shelter, as they were getting more and more dogs coming in, they actually had to pick which dogs they were going to have to euthanize to make space. And a lot of these workers are on Xanax and antidepressants to do their job. And I was just like, it was absolutely horrifying to see this kind of condition. And it is because of just the culture, as you say, in which animals are kept and let go is just way more. I also think it's because in America, it's just a much bigger place. Like, if an animal goes astray, someone's going to bump into it and call up and something like that. I mean, we don't really have stray animals here in the UK, do we?
No, I think it's also spaying and neutering is so important. And I think it's something that often, especially in those communities in America, so around sort of the North Carolina area, often with pit bulls and stuff, people don't want to neuter them because they think that either it will change the dog or it means that they then can't breed them to make puppies. So you're constantly sort of having this this churn of puppies coming out. Whereas I think in the UK, it is a bit better in terms of spaying and neutering, although it's still something that we strongly encourage people to do and push people to do because there are still thousands of homeless animals here.
So PETA is actually, it's not against neutering and...
Oh no, we encourage everyone to spay and neuter. Yeah, because there's so many dogs in the world that anything that can be done to prevent more dogs, especially pit bulls, who are some of the most abused dogs in the world, getting them, the less of them that are being bred into these sort of fighting industries or being used as guard dogs and being chained up over there, the better. So PETA will offer free spaying and neutering to people who have those dogs out there. And a lot of the time people do take them up on it because A, it's free, and also it's better for the dog's health as well.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. Again, it's something I feel like, what is the ethics of, neutering an animal against its will per se? Like, but it totally makes sense, everything you're saying.
Well, I think when it comes to those sorts of questions, I think you've got to think that, humans are the ones who have sort of got animals into the position that they're in. And it's now up to us to try and control the mess that we've essentially created. So if there are, dogs being bred into these miserable lives where they're treated terribly, the absolute best thing that anyone can do is try and prevent more dogs from being bred into that,
Yeah. So you were talking about this shelter in the US, and you were saying that a part of what you do is you try and help alleviate a lot of the issues with these no-kill shelters. So if there's animals that are unwell and suffering, PETA is responsible for euthanasia in their shelter.
Yeah, PETA will euthanize animals who are who are either dying or who could not be rehomed and who are sort of so mentally vulnerable from whatever their past experience has been.
Right. And so obviously before this interview, I've done some research and stuff like that about it. And there's clearly been controversy around PETA on this issue. And what I noticed was, like, I think in PETA's own reporting in 2014, that they said there was around 80% of the animals in the shelter were euthanized, and I felt like that's a staggering amount. And obviously I'm sure there are going to be justifications presented, and I'm not currently making a judgment on it because I don't know enough about it, but the optics of that clearly can't be good for an organization that positions itself as the welfare of animals. Although I will, and it's not me giving you an answer here, that this is something I believe as well, which is when it comes to the alleviating of suffering, it's not just about living for living's sake. I mean, we have this conversation with our own human population of, ethically, do we just keep humans alive for as long as they can when clearly they're suffering? And, the balance of safeguards is a difficult discussion around compassion for fellow sentient beings. But yeah, about that, what I read about, I was shocked to hear that it was 80%.
So the reason that PETA statistics seem higher because other shelters are no kill, but PETA is not going to turn away an animal who would then have a prolonged agonizing death, which if you watch, all of this is available on the PETA website
Yeah.
and you can see for yourself the conditions. And I saw for myself the conditions that the animals are in, and it is absolutely heartbreaking. It is devastating. And for a shelter to be able to turn away an animal in that condition, knowing that they are going to have that death, that is not protecting the rights of that animal, and that is not in the animal's best interest. Like, there are far worse things that someone can endure than a peaceful death. And that's why PETA statistics seem higher. It's just because all the animals are being brought to them because they're being turned away from other places. And also, it's not a shelter where animals are caged up in crates if they are aggressive or if they can't be rehomed because of that aggression. So it is a shelter of last resort. And unfortunately, it is because of that perception that a no-kill shelter is better for animals, when in actual fact, when you look at the state of the animals, it's such a clear choice. I think to most people, when you actually see the condition that they're in, it seems obvious that euthanasia, and that's why in the UK the RSPCA euthanizes animals. It's because it unfortunately is a part of the of that industry of having animals as companions. Chances are they will get to a stage where they're in a position that their life is only suffering, and that's something that they need to be alleviated from. And it doesn't make it nice, but
No,
unfortunately, that's the...
Yeah. I'm not someone who's going to buy it. Not that I've seen a caricature of like PETA enjoying killing animals. Like, that's, I don't really buy into that. But so the animals that would be euthanized are those that are obviously terminally ill. Would aggressive animals that are too aggressive for adoption, would that fall into that category as well?
Yeah, so because a lot of the dogs are pit bull or those types of breeds, and they are used as guard dogs, they are often left up chained on incredibly heavy chains. That's something that PETA US is also working to ban over in the States, is chaining dogs, and they're kept outside in all weather conditions. So whether that's snow, ice, whether that's extreme heat waves, and they often don't have any food or water. So you can only imagine, after years of enduring this, the mental state that some of these dogs would be in. So of course, if the choice is either to try and give them the best few days they can before having a peaceful death, or them living in a cage where humans can't interact with them and they live alone, and there's no quality of life there, then again you have to think what's in the best interest for this animal.
So for dogs like that, for example, like again, I'm asking completely ignorant on this. So rehabilitation is like a lost cause. Like they're so far gone that you're not able to unprogram that aggressive behaviour. And I also know it's a resource thing as well. There's always going to be a balance with that. But I just find that when it comes to like too aggressive to adopt, I don't know. I just feel like clearly this has been considered. I just feel that is there no hope for rehabilitation for these species?
Well, I mean, of course, they're the most abused and the worst. That's not saying every dog in that position is. So, of course, a lot of dogs can endure all of that, and they'll come out of it and they'll still be absolutely the most gentle, docile dogs ever. And of course, they can then be rehomed, and PETA works with a lot of shelters in those areas who then will take those dogs and then rehome them and rehabilitate them. So yeah, it's certainly not every dog, but there are some dogs where the point of aggression that they are at, they could never be rehomed, and then they would just spend their days languishing in a cell, essentially, which I don't think anyone would want for an animal.
No, and yeah, as you say, it's not every animal, but I just, again, like 80, and sometimes it's at 90%, and so it is literally because of these no-kill policies that it is one of. I mean, I'm sure there are other shelters as well, that the reason it is that high is because it is the only place where animals can be taken care. in that
Yeah,
way.
and also something to bear in mind, in the US, there are front groups for animal exploiting industries like the meat and dairy industries and the misleadingly named Centre for Consumer Freedom, which tries to deceive the public about the work that PETA does. And they use these statistics to try and turn people against the work that PETA does. But if you go onto the PETA US website, anyone can see very clearly for themselves, PETA isn't trying to hide this. We're trying to show people, or they're trying to show people, how awful the animals that come to them are, and give context for the whole thing. Because it's like you were sort of saying earlier, without context, anything can sound awful. But I think if people actually take the time to look into it, and they can make an informed decision themselves. And I think that's all PETA asks of people, is to have a look and make the decision themselves.
Yeah, and when I was looking into this, the article I came across was a Washington Post article from 2015, and they say in the article, I am just going to read this paragraph just to contextualize what we've been talking about, but it did say in 2014, according to its own records, so it's even admitting that you are being transparent about this, and it just said that PETA took in 3,017 animals, about 1% of the total number brought to private Virginia shelters. Of those, PETA euthanized 2,455, or 81%. In some prior years, that rate has risen about 90%. And I just, I obviously, having seen that, I felt I definitely had to bring this up in this conversation, because understandably, I'd have people asking, why did I miss this?
Yeah, no, of course. And it probably would be something that people would message you about. And I think, just to add one more point on as well, is that a lot of people in these poor communities, if their animal was needing euthanized, they often can't afford to pay for a vet to euthanize them. So what they will then do is bring the animal to PETA, and PETA will do that for free, because it's in the best interest of the animal. And that's something that very, very few places would do. So again, that's another reason people do actually bring their animals to us, or to PETA US, because they know that whatever is best for the animal, it will be the outcome there.
I heard a story secondhand recently about someone's friend. I think it was in the States. They took that their pet was in serious trouble medically, and they couldn't afford the bills, and the bill for getting the pet euthanized was astounding. And so instead they took it, and they had a shotgun. I'm not going to say anything else, but like, as horrific as that is a reality of like, and so regardless of pricing and that, having a service, and look, this is, I'm undecided on this issue. I think that the points you make sense. And when we come to discussing ethics and compassion, you don't need me saying this, but I'm sort of like thinking out loud. It's a very messy, complicated thing that as human beings we're always trying to work out the ethics and how we weigh things up, and enact policies that lead to the least amount of suffering. And I think especially on, I was mentioning euthanasia of humans as well, the sort of the relationship we have with death, and the sort of the old way of thinking was always that life is the most precious thing and it should be reserved no matter what. We're actually having much more complicated discussion these days around compassion. There's a great organisation in the US called Final Exit, which is all about providing euthanasia for people that are suffering, because it's why you see the battles in the courts with people that are in the most egregious amount of pain, and they're just saying, I want to die, I want the right to die, and they're refused it, and it's difficult. And so it applies to humans, it applies to animals. It seems to be this big ethical quandary that we're dealing with, and so I guess just to sort of end this conversation, when it comes to sort of the ethics with animals, and when it comes to protection, alleviating suffering, are there like internal reviews that are done to sort of update not the code of conduct, but like the ethical code within PETA? Like, obviously you're constantly having research and looking at, I don't know, research on like what animals experience pain in certain ways, or finding about industries that are, undertaking certain practices. But has PETA's ethics changed since its conception? Like, are there things that PETA used to stand by that it doesn't now, for example? Sorry, that's a really hard last question to end on.
I wouldn't say in terms of animal suffering. No, I think it's always been very clear on how animals suffer. I suppose what maybe has changed over the years is the research that we have to back that up. You know, with fish, for example, there's now been so many scientific studies that prove that fish do feel pain just like cats or dogs would, and that, you know, they are sentient animals, which I suppose prior to that research, you know, would maybe have been harder to push that message. So things like that we're always keeping an eye on, in terms of how animal sentience is being perceived, or things like that. But no, I mean, PETA's founder Ingrid, you know, she's always been, you know, an absolute powerhouse against ending animal suffering, and what she's achieved through PETA over the past sort of 40 odd years is just incredible.
Had you met her?
Yes, yeah, quite a few times, yeah.
Awesome. And what's she like?
Oh, she's incredible. She's so inspiring.
I know she's your boss, so you are going to say nice things, but I mean, like, yeah, she does seem like an amazing human being that is quite a foreseer, like, you know, quite a visionary in terms of, especially when she started it, and like how far our attitudes with animals and our relationship with nature has changed. She was really at the forefront of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And she is just unstoppable. You know, she's in her early 70s now, and she's still working like 20-hour days. So I think when you have someone like that to look up to and follow their lead, you know, it's incredibly motivating, and everything she does is for animals. And that's something that's always been so inspiring for me, and was definitely a huge reason why I wanted to be at PETA, because I felt there was no issue where animals were suffering that would ever be shied away from. And I think it's one of those things that I always want to be able to look back, hopefully, or have people look back and think, you know, PETA was on the right side of history. And that's something that I strongly believe that we are. And that's why I want to make it my life's work to get other people to think that about us as well.
And is it your life's work in the sense of when you clock off at the end of the day? I know work doesn't really work like that these days. It's kind of, you just keep working whenever you can. But do you live and breathe animal activism? Does it just dominate every aspect of your life? So when you're not at work, are you constantly thinking about, like, do you get to break away from it? And that, you know, that's not a criticism. Like, there are a lot of things I do that are passionate and I don't switch off about. But I'm just curious, like, it is all around us, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's something when, you know, when you think of the word activist, you know, you do kind of always just think of someone who's out like picketing at a protest and that kind of thing. And whilst that is a part of it, and that is something I do, even the small choices we make, like, you know, obviously me being vegan, but for someone who perhaps was, you know, still maybe a bit more like you and undecided, or trying bits here and there and trying to eat, you know, new vegan foods, you know, you choosing to buy like a vegan egg product instead of an egg, you know, that in itself is that's an act, and that's, you know, making a decision that helps animals. So I suppose, yeah, every decision I make in terms of what I'm consuming and what I'm doing is about animals. But I suppose because I've been doing it for so long, it's, you know, I'm not always like, I'm eating this Beyond Meat burger for animals, you know. But no, I mean, I think it's one of those things when you love what you do, not to be super cliche, but, you know, it doesn't feel like work. And I think that's something where, you know, yes, I'm not always sitting in front of my laptop, but it's always something that I am aware of and I am thinking of. And subtly, you know, trying to push here and there. So,
and taking this right back to the start, when you were speaking about sort of your journey, and you said that you studied criminology. I did psychology at uni, and I did a module on criminology. Yes, it wasn't a full like semester on it, and it was absolutely fascinating. But you wanted to go into the police force. So clearly there's something there in your values, which obviously has led to where you are now. So like, what was it that made you want to get into the police force specifically? Like, what inspired that initially?
No, that's a good question. I think, so I've always been someone who loves animals. I've always had an affinity with animals. But I guess the jobs that at the time I thought would be with animals, it was kind of either a vet or a zookeeper or something, and those weren't things I wanted to do. So then I suppose I knew I wanted to help people, and I guess doing criminology, the obvious path with that was sort of going into the police. I also did an interview with MI5 as well.
Really?
didn't get the job. But yeah, I thought I would have.
Well, even if you got the job, you'd have to say you didn't get the job.
Yeah, this is always the start.
Yeah, I did see the background peeling away, some green screen. Yeah.
But no, with the police, it was funny. I actually got offered the internship with PETA on the same day that I got called for an interview with the Special Police, which is a Scottish specific sort of branch of the police. And, I had to make this decision of what I wanted to do. But at that stage, I knew that I really did want to help animals. And I think there is definitely that element of, being the voice for the voiceless and speaking out for those who, can't say what they want to happen themselves. And I think that ultimately was what made me want to work for animals instead. Not saying that the police would even have had me, but no. I'm very happy with the way it's all worked out. And I think actually something about the criminology degree that was very interesting was that we learned how a lot of serial killers or murderers often started out by harming animals, and how when that went unregulated or unnoticed because people weren't taking it seriously because it was animals they were harming and not humans, and then you see where those people end up. That was something that I always found very interesting, and just always would feel if people took animal cruelty more seriously as they should, then goodness knows how many human lives could have been saved down the line as well.
Hadn't even thought about that. See, this is the thing, is we could talk for another couple of hours just off that little bit of information. But listen, Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on this show, and it's been amazing chatting, and keep up all the great work you're doing. I'll put your details in the description of this episode. If you ever want to see really good vegan treats, follow Jennifer on Instagram or social, because always posting amazing stuff. What's the last massive vegan surprise you ever had? Like, what was the last vegan meal or treat that you found that you were like, everyone needs to have this?
Oh, so unfortunately, this is I'll do a restaurant one and then a supermarket one. So the restaurant one is probably a new all vegan Chinese restaurant in London called Tofu Vegan, which is incredible, and everything on the menu is vegan, and it's all like meat replacements, like vegan duck, vegan beef, vegan chicken. Like, it's incredible. Vegan fish, like, amazing.
Can I just say on that, I recently went to visit a friend of mine in Bath, and he's a vegan, and when I got there he was saying, we're going to get a Chinese tonight, and straight away I was like, but you're vegan, like, I've never associated with it. And we went to this place where they did tofu, and I had like it was like the chicken sea salt, but it was like tofu, and then this chili one. It was the best thing I've had in ages, because normally tofu is like soft and slimy, which is all right, but this was like really crispy, and it just shows you it's all in the preparation when it comes to vegan food. But is that in London, right?
Yeah, so that one's in London.
What's it called?
And then Tofu Vegan.
All right, I'm going to this place.
Yeah, you need to. It's honestly a game changer. And then supermarket launch. This might be really boring, but you can now get these amazing Chicago town like vegan cheese and like jackfruit pepperoni pizzas, and they have a stuffed crust. Oh my god! Like, hangovers are never going to be the same again now.
They also do they do the barbecue jackfruit pizzas. Yeah. Lots of supermarkets do barbecue jackfruit pizzas, and they do have like bits of cheese on it. If people listening or watching have never had barbecue jackfruit, especially in burritos and that, do it. Barbecue jackfruit. I never knew anything about it. Like, I don't think you can even buy it fully because they're like massive, aren't they? Jackfruit.
So you can get it in like shredded tins. They shred it up for you. And yeah, you can buy it in tins, sort of usually in like the World Food sort of Caribbean section. But I don't think personally I would know enough how to make it good.
Yeah.
So I tend to buy it when it's been pre-prepared by someone else. But I'm sure any budding chefs out there could do amazing things with it. Because it's so good and tastes just like sort of pulled pork, I suppose.
It's about the texture. It replicates it so well. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm with you on the second recommendation, and the tofu vegan place I'm going to check out as well. Jennifer, thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's been so lovely.